Dear friends, I had shared this set of slides yesterday based on a talk that I gave a couple of days ago on how we can actually achieve the greater good. Something that we hear a lot about with politicians saying that they're doing things for the greater good. Well, how do we know that they're doing it for the greater good? Or are they doing something that is going to benefit some particular sector at the expense of another sector? And the way to do that is through a cost benefit analysis. And I want to sort of, in this talk, outline how it's done and also, address some of the misapprehensions that people have about cost benefit analysis. So by the end of this talk, you would become a great supporter of cost benefit analysis as the requirement for all public policy in the world. So I introduce this talk first, then I show how a cost benefit analysis is done. I provide 4 examples, and then I conclude. So the greater good is the stated objective of most governments. Everyone says we want to achieve the greater good. But what exactly is the greater good? What we as economists have adopted, and this is pretty universal, given the various analysis about this whole thing, we can go on forever. But really, at the end of the day, Jeremy Bentham's concept of the greatest happiness of the greatest number works for everybody as a kind of a cross-check on people's biases and ideologies. So by making sure that we are achieving the greatest happiness of the greatest number, we're likely to be going in the right direction as a society. So this is a very old concept. It's more than 250 years old now, and it has served society very well. There are 2 issues involved with this concept. One is that happiness is subjective. We think that happiness is all personal and it's all that, mental health state and all that. But at the end of the day, can we try to get an objective standard for the greater good, for happiness? The other issue is that when we are dealing with this issue, it's government policy, and the governments do not have an infinite amount of money. And so what they have to do is to make sure that they're achieving a number of goods at the same time. The greater good is among all possible goods. So the government is providing health, education, roads, and other things, and defense, and so on. So how do we have to balance everything out at some level? And in economics, we have a simple concept called the marginal social cost. The net slight cost to society, the marginal, at the margin of a particular policy, and the cost and the marginal social benefit of the particular policy. So when we look at across all policies, the rule that we need to follow is that the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit of all government interventions. At that point, we have reached the optimum. Okay. So what this does is it ensures that we don't overspend in something and underspend in another thing. So for example, we want to save the life of somebody in a traffic accident by road improvements. We should not spend more than what we would be spending for example, cancer research or some such thing. So there has to be a balance across all policy areas. The cost benefit analysis is designed to achieve both these goals. It is a bit of an objective standard and also makes sure that we don't overspend in anything. Now, there are very serious challenges to this issue. This is not a simple exercise. So we are not in a position to achieve a very objective policy process for many reasons. One of them is that we all have different understandings of the world. We have different ideologies or worldviews, and we won't go into how it actually develops. Each of us are different in certain ways, environmental and other factors. In any case, it's very hard to get agreement about policy choices among people. And we also have a thing called Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem in his 1950 paper. He talks about the difficulty in the concept of social welfare. So, welfare economics is all about maximizing social welfare. But really at the heart of the thing is this fundamental problem that we aren't in a position to identify what exactly it is. And the second one is that we all suffer from cognitive biases. And these biases can be a large number of them. There are tens of them. And a simple one, for example, confirmation bias. We cherry pick things that we think are going to support our view, and we avoid looking at things that may not support our view. Anything that we see for the first time around tells us, it sort of anchors our conception of a thing, the initial claims, and that influences how we think about things. And that's how it happened with the COVID pandemic, that, initially it presented as a very large, pandemic. And so everyone is anchored to that, and it's not able to get out of that mindset and look at the data objectively. Halo effect is very common, that we get influenced by people whom we have high regard for or we admire. And let's say some politicians might be there in that category, or health officers or whoever, and we admire them and we get swayed by their views. The bandwagon effect is another part of the story, which is the tendency for groupthink. And this is very well analyzed in the social psychology literature, how strongly we tend to be influenced by groups. And of course, there's many more. So I've cited a paper, Cognition and Cost-Benefit Analysis by Cass Sunstein. He has listed many other such things. What Sunstein says is really important. And I'll mention slightly what exactly does it mean in real life, because I'll come to that in a second. Let me finish this. He says that without a cost-benefit analysis, we will tend to exaggerate the benefits and ignore the costs. And so he says we should do a cost-benefit analysis. He says poor judgments by individuals and societies can result from heuristics, which is all these rules that we create, to guide our thinking, informational and reputational cascades, basically groupthink essentially. And so what happens is that benefits are on screen. That means we can see the benefits more clearly. We think we see them more clearly. Our costs, we ignore. We ignore the systemic effects of interventions. For example, the lockdowns, we ignore it. We see things in isolation. We see COVID in isolation, and we suffer from intense emotional reactions. And so the cost-benefit analysis serves as a corrective to these cognitive problems. And so the thing I was going to mention is this very funny thing that happened. Cass Sunstein, he's a very famous guy. He ran the cost-benefit analysis program for President Obama, very well-connected guy and very famous economist. And so I had praised his work in one of my tweets recently. And so he sort of thanked me. I said I normally don't recommend Sunstein's work because of his nudge theory concept. But then he sort of thanked me and said, okay, is that right? And I said, look, yeah, I admire your work. I don't agree with your nudge concept. And here, for your information, is the cost-benefit analysis based on your guidance that I've done with Professor Gigi Foster for Australia, and it shows how terribly calamitous the costs have been to Australia of these lockdowns. And then I searched the internet and said, what did Cass Sunstein really say about the lockdowns? Did he say anything at all in the last 2 years? And yes, he had actually said that. In March 2020, he advocated the strongest possible lockdowns and closures and everything. And he said that we should do it effectively without a cost-benefit analysis. And so, we're looking at this guy, Cass Sunstein. He sort of says, economists know better than others because we can avoid our biases and so on. We are better. But you look at what happened in this case. So, he ignored the systemic effects of lockdowns. He ignored completely. He talked about the benefits, the benefits of $5 trillion in benefits, and that's grossly exaggerated of the lockdowns. But that is based on some initial data, and I don't mind, people make mistakes that way. But he completely ignored the costs of lockdowns, which are very well known in the literature, by the way. In economics, we know that poverty increases mortality and so on and so forth. We know how closing down schools harms children. We know all that stuff. So he completely ignored all those effects. He saw COVID in isolation. That was the second mistake he made. He completely breached his own recommendation, right? So he's saying, we only need to focus on COVID. Well, that's exactly the wrong thing to do. That's why you're supposed to be an economist and look at the whole story. And then the third was the intense emotional reaction. And you could read in that article, Cass Sunstein being emotionally involved. The worst part of it is that when I mentioned to him that, hey, I just saw your article and hey, this breaches your own guidance. Guess what did Mr. Cass Sunstein do? He blocked me, okay? He blocked me on Twitter. Why? Because he, like anybody else, suffers from the same biases that humans suffer. And he was emotionally involved in what he had said. And it'd be very hard for him to change his opinion, even though the facts are very much against him and 100% against him. So Here's the interesting thing that, the guru of cost benefit analysis, the man who wrote a book on the topic, many articles, who ran President Obama's cost benefit analysis unit, who is very well cited and regarded across the world, and also for his nudge and behavioral economics work, which I completely disagree with, by the way, but that's a different issue. In fact, I can tell you about that right away as well. That if you can think about Cass Sunstein being the most biased man I have come across in this entire lockdown process, he is completely berserk, and he's gone and blocked me and all that. You consider that kind of a severe emotional show of mindset where he can't see outside the tunnel vision that he's created. Well, how can such people who actually run the so-called behavioral economics and nudge models and so on, how can such people be trusted to guide society? The reason why Hayek, and I sort of can take his book out here if I have it, I don't have it readily available. The fatal conceit of Cass Sunstein is that he and other economists are somehow better than the rest of us. And they will therefore tell us and do the right thing by nudging us in the right direction. No, they cannot. And this is the fatal conceit that all these intellectuals and experts suffer from. And they have obviously failed us in so many ways. But the point I think being made here is that, yes, a cost-benefit analysis, when it's done properly, will actually show you the truth about a particular thing. Even if it's not a perfect answer, it's a very good answer, a way to get out of your own biases. So, even the guru of cost-benefit analysis, Sunstein, has flunked completely. Give him an F, a fail in cost-benefit analysis because of his approach. And of course, the nudge theory is complete nonsense and communism, and let's not even go there right now. So coming back to the cost-benefit analysis benefits. So, when leaders decide policy, and remember, policy is always decided by leaders. Either they are, elected by us, or they are kings, or they are dictators. Either way, they are, people who are leaders. And the Rousseau's concept of general will said that all the desires or wishes of the people get represented in the leaders through the general will. He calls it the general will. And so the opinion of the leader itself is the correct answer, according to Rousseau. And people like Thomas Hobbes would strongly support it, of course. So then we see that was the model that continued with us for hundreds and thousands of years. And that model has significant limitations, as we mentioned: ignorance, lack of broad understandings, and a lack of a proper cost-benefit analysis. However, in the last 4 years or so, this is just about 40, 50 years ago, that the cost-benefit analysis became a part and parcel of modern democracies, and particularly in the Anglo-Saxon democracies. I'll come to that in a moment. But in that model, what happens is we still regard and respect the rights of the democratically elected leader, or whoever the leader, to form the final opinion or the decision, but they will use the advice from a cost-benefit analysis that is supposed to be conducted independently of them. So somebody independent, generally led by an economist, will conduct the cost-benefit analysis. And this is, I will argue, a much better way to get good public policy for the greater good. What is one of the most interesting things that the average person is not familiar with this particular issue, but this is probably the most significant one single item in the cost-benefit analysis process that is the most beneficial. Basically identifying all the costs and all the benefits, okay? And most of these things are unseen. We do not see them easily. We need to really see carefully before we get the answer. And I've written a book for children in economics called Seeing the Invisible, because without being able to see the invisible, you cannot make public policy and should not make public policy. So a good example is the unintended consequences. When you don't see the unseen, like Cass Sunstein didn't see the unseen, which is the effects of lockdowns. What he does is he causes unintended consequences, which are the complete calamitous, catastrophic consequences of lockdowns. Okay, so that's what happened when you don't see these unseen things. One of the best ways to understand what is this thing about the unseen is the broken window fallacy. Many of you might have heard of it. If not, read Friedrich Bastiat. I think his name is Friedrich, I forget, but Bastiat, 1850. He wrote this book, and in which he talks about the seen and the unseen, gives an example that a window is broken. And so, people think that now the window is broken, so it's a great thing to happen. Now we got, new jobs coming out of this thing for the glazier and other people, carpenters, etc. So it's a great thing for the economy to have the window broken. Okay, so that is the argument many people make, and they are the Keynesians, by the way. Even today, they make the same argument. But what they miss out is that the money that is now required to repair the window would have been otherwise spent on other things. So they would have bought maybe a suit, maybe something more interesting, for the person, and they created jobs in that area. So the job fallacy is that no, it didn't create new jobs. It actually created the same number of jobs. The jobs were the same. What happened now is most important, is that the people are poorer, because now earlier they could have afforded the window and the suit. They would have had a good suit and a window. Now they only have a window. They're much poorer. And so what has happened is we've got to see these effects of a particular thing before we start counting things. And the small effect thing is also very important. When children get affected by the lockdowns, the small effects, every single child gets a small effect, negative effect. But when it adds up, it's quite huge, and it affects them finally in their entire life. So these small effects have to be considered as well. The very idea of doing this analysis of identifying the costs and benefits is very illuminating, one of the best things you can do in a cost and benefit analysis. The other thing about cost benefit analysis is it makes policymakers' assumptions explicit. So, every policymaker or subject matter specialist, could be an environmentalist, could be a town planner, could be public health specialist. They all have certain assumptions. They make these assumptions. In almost all cases, like the public health case is a good example, they make the assumption that everything operates according to a mathematical model. The world is converted into a simple model, a differential equations model that anybody with the basic arithmetic and mathematics can do. And apparently that model will give them the answer about how the world runs, how the pandemics run. And these assumptions are based on further assumptions down the line, and it's ultimately garbage in and garbage out. During the process of a CBA, cost benefit analysis, the subject matter specialists are asked to spell out their assumptions. And then we assess how probable are these things. When people say it's as big as Spanish flu, well, how probable is it? Look at your model, tell us a bit more, and look at the actual data, and so on. So that's the job of the economist who is supervising the cost benefit analysis, to question the assumptions. They verify the assumptions, the economists, and in any case, once the CBA, the cost benefit analysis, is published, the entire community can have a look at the assumptions. And if they are stupid, well, there you are. You have to do the whole thing again because you made wrong assumptions. So spelling out assumptions is probably the other second major benefit of a cost benefit analysis. Now, the common person, and even many policymakers, have a lot of misapprehensions and misunderstandings about the cost benefit analysis. One of the things they say, hey, you can't put a monetary value on life, and nobody is trying to do that. Okay, so please keep in mind when people see numbers against the number of lives or years of life, etc., they're not valuing that life in that sense. They're not putting that money value on that thing. What they're saying is that if we had so much money, so it's effectively the government has that extra money, has to use the money for health, public health, or whatever. Now, that money can be used either through lockdowns and therefore funding people to sit at home. That's one way to do the things. Or it can do by improving, hospitals and so on. Either way, the net result is we're talking about the expenditure of the government here. The government has limited amount of money. And so it needs to say, okay, if I'm to value a life in a road accident, a cancer death, or a COVID death equally, which is the whole point, then I need to have a standard unit by which I can say that this much expenditure must give me that many years of life. So if I spend $10 million, I must get X amount of years of life for a cancer patient. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. And this kind of analysis called statistical value of life is a very standard thing in the cost benefit analysis toolkit. And people think it's about valuing life. No, we're not valuing. We're valuing how much money the government should spend to save a life in different fields. We can't be spending $100 million to save one life from COVID and spend only $500,000 to save a life from cancer. This is the whole point we mentioned earlier. The marginal social cost must equal the marginal social benefit. So you please keep in mind that this is basically a method to make sure we don't overspend on anything. Then, of course, cost benefit analysis, everybody's, they say being treated the same, but they're not really the same. Of course, that's not true. But for the practical purposes and for also some ethical purposes, this is not a bad thing to do. Of course, we should not impinge on anyone's freedom, and so people value their freedoms differently, and we must not impinge on it. And so the way to do that is to minimize anything that impinges on people's freedom. That's what a cost benefit analysis does. It looks at options that minimize the impact on freedom. And of course, the other issue is, people say, oh, but you're not looking at how much the redistribution of is taking place. So, for example, lockdowns caused a massive redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. This was quite a huge thing. It's been observed everywhere. And these distributional effects are important and they should be noted, but they're not counted as far as the cost benefit analysis final calculations are concerned, because the cost benefit analysis is supposed to give you a particular perspective. You then apply other perspectives to make the final answer, but they don't expect a cost benefit analysis to give you all the answers. Now, in the West, this has been adopted since 1981. And President Ronald Reagan was the first leader in the West to introduce this concept. He made it a law to require this particular requirement of cost benefit analysis for regulations in the USA, and was very rapidly adopted in the UK and Australia in the 1980s itself. By 1984, we were doing cost benefit analysis in Australia. In Australia, a legislative impact assessment or something of the sort is attached to a cabinet submission. Whenever there is a major policy change or a legislation, then there is a LIA that's attached. LIA is nothing but a cost benefit analysis, but because it's not required to be published. Sometimes they are published, but just keep in mind that that's a big failure that we don't publish the cost benefit analysis of different legislation in Australia. We should. For subordinate legislation, which is the standard regulation or the rules, there are requirements for the conduct of CBA through a regulatory impact statement. Now, for all these laws and interventions, particularly the ones that impose only a minor burden, then the expectation is that we do only what is called a multi-criteria analysis. A multi-criteria analysis is very simple, and I'll come to that in a second. So consider a particular road-related project. So there are two options to reduce the road-related fatalities or accidents. And so we look at the option 1 and option 2, and we find that we list out the things that, how many, we weight these things 40%, 50%, 10%, or whatever the weight that we give to different activities or outcomes. And then we assign a score, which is based on the expert's opinion of that particular area. And we finally get a weighted score, which tells us at the end, which one is the better option. It is very similar to the pros and cons model that we apply in our day-to-day life, which is Benjamin Franklin's, he introduced in writing, but this is obviously something which we have done as humanity from the very beginning. We have pros and cons of everything, including whether to marry someone or marry someone else, and so on and so forth, to buy a car A or buy a car B. That's exactly what a multi-criteria analysis is. And if you do a bit of more formal, then it becomes a proper cost-benefit analysis, which can be used for informing policy. And in fact, these particular things can be done in 4 hours, 6 hours, and that's good enough. For many, many things, that's a pretty good enough exercise. In Australia, and I'm giving the example of Victoria, there was the Competition and Efficiency Commission, now the Better Regulation Victoria, which publishes guidance on how CBAs are done and then provides training to the departments. And so the departments are able to undertake the smaller CBAs with multi-criteria analysis or simple calculations. They can do it on their own. For complex CBAs, the departments do need to hire specialized consultants because it is a very specialized exercise at some level once you enter into a complex area. I'll come to one example. So how do we do a CBA? We need to have evidence of the problem. And so that is done through literature survey. We look at the entire published literature, peer-reviewed studies, and then try to find out what exactly is the magnitude of the problem. We look at the options that people are trying to suggest that this can be done or that can be done. And we look at that particular, in terms of options, we notice that the costs are generally easier to assess than benefits. But of course, as I mentioned, costs are not always properly identified. So the first thing is to identify them properly. Then they're generally easier to assess than benefits. Benefits are often very difficult to assess, and there's a thing called willingness to pay or a stated preference survey, which can be conducted. And that's one way to do it. For complex CBAs, the simple ones can be done simply by using the judgment. I talked about the weights that we put on different things, and that should be enough for a simple cost-benefit analysis. Then, of course, as you go into the more complex ones, you're going to put different values or different years. So things, kick in after 4 years, 5 years, the impacts. And so you start discounting them back to the current present value. And so you use a social discount rate generally, which is lower than the market rate. Uncertainty is a big issue in cost-benefit analysis that's dealt with through sensitivity analysis and an ex post CBA. So what we're talking about is ex ante, the thing that's done before a particular policy is introduced. But an ex post is the one that's done after the policy is implemented. And then we have real high quality data about the actual impacts. And then we can actually reduce the uncertainty and decide whether this policy is working, or we can try to modify the policy to improve it. The thing about departments is obviously that they, it's not expected that they prepare perfect CBAs themselves. And even if they have consultants, they can be heavily biased towards the minister's opinion. That's one of the unfortunate facts of life, that the consultants themselves are heavily biased. So what happens then is we have three methods in Victoria and across the country in Australia, similar methods, where there's an independent agency that will actually certify that the cost-benefit analysis is of acceptable quality. In this case, please note, and this is my big concern, because the Better Regulation Commissioner in Victoria doesn't really ask many questions about the nature of the problem and the evidence or the assumptions. They don't. They basically just confirm that you've actually just got the logic right and you've put your numbers and your assumptions in writing. They do not actually question that thing, which is a big gap. They should actually question the assumptions. Nevertheless, there are the central agencies, the premiers and treasury departments, and that's where I was operating for 15 years. And the treasury department is much more free and much more, questioning in terms of what it provides advice on. So we will actually go and look at the assumptions. We'll look at the nature of the problem. We'll go deep inside and say, no, this doesn't sound right. Okay. So even if something has been agreed by the Better Regulation Commissioner as a good CBA, the Treasury might say, no, it's not a good one, actually. And so these are the gaps. And so the cabinet will get independent advice from the Treasury on the quality of the CBA. And of course, finally, the CBAs are published. They go to the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee of Parliament, which has powers to review and guide any policy process changes in Victoria. Similar processes operate in the country. A cost-benefit analysis is a cousin of CBA. This is something that is used largely in health sector, health economics. Basically, it's similar to buying, two cars. So we're comparing two things and saying, okay, which is more effective in terms of, say, mileage or whatever. And so in health, what we have are generally, we count the benefits in quality adjusted life years. So we look at an intervention which delivers the most QALYs for the lowest cost. And a threshold can be used sometimes to save time. For example, a health intervention that costs, say, $50,000 per QALY delivered would be accepted, while an intervention that costs $75,000 might be rejected. So it's basically a way to compare two different ways to improve a particular health situation or energy situation or environmental situation. So consider this environmental example. Let's say there is a project which reduces emissions of some pollutant. The first option is more costly, it's $500,000, but then the reduction is better. It's cheaper. It reduces more emissions per unit. So it has cost $50,000 to reduce 1 unit of pollution, and the other one costs $60,000 to society. So we would say, okay, let's go for option A. Now, there are a lot of weaknesses of this particular approach, and I won't go into that, but this is basically the cost effectiveness analysis, which is very commonly used in health economics and could have easily been used in lockdowns, to assess lockdowns versus some other interventions and so on. So that was not done. Now, I'll give you a bit more insight into how a CBA is done, and then 4 examples. So one of the things that we have to do is that CBA is a part of the policy development process. It doesn't sit on its own. It is not an isolated piece of work. So we begin by asking what would happen without any role for the government, and that is the base case. we would then identify what exactly is the problem with the base case. The thing called market failure, externality, information failure, whatever it is, we need to identify that and say that here's a problem, okay? Then we need to ask, should the government do anything about it at all? And there are many areas where, even if there's a market failure, there's no reason for the government to interfere. There are many, many areas like this, cultural areas or many minor environmental areas or some such thing. We don't want to get involved in everything. The government should be doing minimum things rather than the maximum. And then, of course, if we do think that it's required for the government to do something, then we say, okay, what exactly can be done? There are the options. And we look at the full suite of options, the less onerous options, the less burdensome, less intrusive, all the way to the more intrusive, including, say, prohibition. A lockdown is pretty much a prohibition. It says you can't get out of your house. And so that's the most intrusive, whereas you could have used the least intrusive, which is a voluntary social distancing, okay? So then we apply a freedom test. So how much freedom is removed by these options? Because remember, we said we want to minimize the loss of freedom. Otherwise, we really, encroaching into people's private preferences. So there are people who would say, oh, yeah, I love lockdowns. I like staying at home, lockdown at home. I feel safe. Others say, no, that's really not good for me. I want to be free. So either way, you need to apply the freedom test. Then you apply the strategic gaming test. So, when lockdowns were there, strategic gaming takes place. Some people will avoid the lockdown in some particular clever way. So, we had the Melbourne, the Ring of Steel, where you couldn't enter the regional areas, and people were trying to use all sorts of devious methods to game the system. And they were actually going up and down through maybe a public transport. They could take a train, and the train would go straight from, Melbourne all the way to the region. And that's one way to break the thing. And so many other ways were applied by people to game the system. That's strategic gaming. You need to understand that its policy is not going to be accepted by the people, all of it 100%. So some of them will, game it. Then we have a government failure. So government failure is a good example. How do we exactly implement lockdowns? How do we enforce mask mandates outdoors, for example? And this I won't go into detail. I'll come after this whole thing is over some other day. But I can only tell you that it was very hard for people in Victoria as well to enforce their mandates. And so it failed. The lockdowns in many cases didn't really work the way they were supposed to. The mask mandates didn't work properly. And I'm not saying this should have been done, but I'm saying that this is how we should analyze the policy or the option in terms of the failures that can occur in terms of enforcement, implementation, and so on, administration. We have to then look at the real experience. How is such a thing ever been done? Where has it been done? What are the learnings from that? And that kind of thing will then, out of the 10 options that say we identified in the question number 4, we may end up with 2 options that we want to consider for a proper cost-benefit analysis. That's when we go into question 9. That's when the CBA comes in. It is not the first question. It is the second but last question. Once we have a recommended option, we want to do a transitional path. How exactly do we go from the current policy to the new policy? And remember, many of these things can be done in exactly 3 to 4 hours of thinking. You don't need to do 4 months of it, but a good one in some complex cases can take 6 months to do a cost-benefit analysis. Some of the most difficult cost-benefit analysis that I've come across are in environmental policy, town planning policy, infrastructure. In all these cases, what we notice is that there are these externalities. What I do then affects somebody else. It's not just between me and, say, the buyer or seller, what I'm dealing with. It's something the third party gets affected. And that could be the environment, could be the view that of my house that others get, or the congestion that I create, and so on. So that's basically externalities problem. Agglomeration effects are considered greatly important for infrastructure. When we say we build highways or freeways to the city, we say that that's because we get people faster to their workplace, and therefore the density of the workers creates the agglomeration effect, which leads to productivity. So these are all arguments made in the literature, but you can see they are very complicated arguments. And so when an externality is involved, and the examples I'm going to give you are all involving externalities, then things get really complicated. So consider this one, plastic bag ban. So South Australia, it was one of the first, I think probably the first in Australia to ban plastic bags in the retail bags that we use, the gray bags. and that is 2009. Other states joined in, Victoria 2019, New South Wales just the 1st of this month, 1st of June 2022. Victoria conducted a cost-benefit analysis for the plastic ban in 2016, and it considered 4 options. First, do nothing, which is the status quo, always the option. Then ban the high-density polyethylene bags and the biodegradable ones, ban others, etc. Then ban all plastic bags. And then they recommended, let's ban everything. I'll just give you a summary of what actually they did in their entire analysis. So on the first left-hand side of the table, you see is a list of things, that can happen. Some costs, some things cost can reduce, some costs can increase, some litter can reduce, can reduce, landfill costs can reduce. Administration can be high cost in some cases, and so on. So essentially, each option is then considered in terms of the net present value of its total 10-year cost to society. And then we do what is called at the bottom, you see BCR. I've underlined in red. A BCR is essentially the benefit cost ratio. And so the options 2 and 3 are basically marginal. They have almost like no particularly great benefit compared to the costs. Option number 4 is allegedly very beneficial. Well, not very beneficial. 1.28 is not a great one to have, but it's considered beneficial enough to say, okay, yeah, this might be a good option to consider. But now, you see, here's the beauty of the cost benefit analysis. By putting out information like this, a person like me can completely see how badly done this cost benefit analysis is. So it's basically a political document meant to sell to us the idea that we should ban plastic bags. In reality, and I'll come to that in a second. First of all, the BCR is very low. Okay, that's not good enough. Second, the moment we fix the flaws in the CBA, the BCR will go negative, and I'll show you in a second. So when what the CBA has done is that it's grossly exaggerated the problem. It has, in its own document, says that the proportion of, there is a paucity of information available on the damage costs of litter. We don't know, he says, they're basically saying, we don't know how much it costs, damage to the environment, the oceans. But, we still consume that of the plastic bag litter, then 48% actually enters the marine environment. Well, there we are. We sort of make a very strong assumption that, we exaggerate the whole problem. We don't look at it. To me, I would ask the simple question. So the plastic bags in the marine environment, from what I understand, are coming from countries like Indonesia, India, and others, which have got absolutely no waste management practices. And so the stuff goes and damages, and about 90% or 95% of the litter in the oceans comes from these countries. So how does this actually go and fix that problem? So it's not actually fixing anything significant. Then we are making vast assumptions that Australia, the whole thing goes, the bags are going into the environment. I can tell you honestly that not a single bag has left my hand and gone into anything but the waste bin and then gone to the landfill over the last 22 years that I've been in Australia. So no, it doesn't really happen. So we're talking about grossly exaggerating the problem. Therefore, the benefits are exaggerated, which is a typical thing for bad CBAs. Then this whole thing completely ignores the benefits to consumers. It only considers the costs to consumers, but forgets that there's a real benefit of the plastic bags. These plastic bags, you don't have to carry them from home. You don't have to put them in the car. You go inside, you get the stuff, and then you go home. And so what happens is that there's a lot of unintended consequences which are not considered. So people are now buying a lot of these big plastic bags in the spur of the moment. So I went recently to Kmart to get, one jacket for myself. A $10 jacket, which is what I always like, a simple thing. But then in the process, I also found a few other things. And by the time I finished, I had 10 things in my hand or something like that. And I couldn't carry them in. And so I had to buy a bag. So I went without a bag because I didn't expect buying more than one thing. I got some 7-8 things. And now I have to buy a bag. And the bags are 15 cents or whatever it is. And then they pile up. And so the whole house is flooded with bags. And my wife works as a social worker. And she tells me where she goes, the place is completely heaps and heaps and heaps of these plastic bags, the big ones. And the other one is that I have to actually purchase the same plastic bags that they were selling, giving us free of cost in Safeway and other places. I had to go and purchase 1,000 of them because I needed to line the bins that are in the house. And then they are again, disposed in the landfill. but then I had to go and buy the same old number of bags. So I actually bought the same bags. I would say a very limited amount of reduction took place in plastic bags in Australia because my behavior changed. I had now to buy those things that I was earlier getting free. And then I was buying these huge plastic bags, the big ones that I don't use, and they're like sitting like a mountain in my house. Now, these costs were completely ignored. These consequences were completely ignored in the cost benefit analysis. The moment you put them in, the BCI will go negative. Okay, it will go negative. In fact, there's also evidence very clear from the CSIRO research. CSIRO had studied and said that in the last 9 years, the plastic waste has gone down by a third. And that was basically not because Victoria had banned or New South Wales had banned. On its own, people are conscious, they're reducing this thing. So it is already reducing, number one. Number two, a 2013 study found in South Australia that the lightweight bags were actually reducing, but the waste from the bigger ones was on the bin bags was increasing. So it was basically counterbalanced. There was no net change in the waste, in the litter. Sorry, this is not litter. This is waste. But we're talking about litter. And so the litter problem has not been analyzed properly. We're making wild assumptions in this cost benefit analysis. It was a very badly done cost benefit analysis. And so what I recommend as an economist is very straightforward. You tax plastic bags. Put a 1 cent tax on a plastic bag. That can fund litter removal programs towards the place where the Regina River enters the marine environment or something of the sort. You put in vast amount of resources to eliminate the litter that is entering the oceans, okay? That would be way cheaper than what we have done through the ban on plastic bags. And we've also caused massive amount of inconvenience. Now, of course, we live with this, but the example of the CBA, the benefit of a CBA, I can tell you why it's wrong. So this is something which is very hard to explain to people unless we have a document in front of us. And now we can say, oh my God, these guys didn't do this properly at all. And so it was a fraudulent, I won't say fraudulent, it's a stupid CBA, maybe politically involved or whatever. But it's a bad exercise. But that's what the benefit of CBA is. We can see through bad arguments. Now, another example is landfill levy. Now, in Victoria, there's a very significant levy introduced since 1992 to apparently offset the environmental costs and discourage the people from generating waste. So they should not, they're charged heavily for that. And it does work to an extent for industries. So when industries are putting the waste in the landfill, they actually are paying that directly. And so they are trying to reduce their waste. Now, the residential customers, you're aware, most of your residential customers, you don't actually pay any, the amount that you pay for your waste does not vary based on the amount that you put in. You can put more, you can fill the bin, or you can put half, and you still pay the same because it's a fixed cost that's passed on by the councils to you. Therefore, it doesn't really affect the average person, who are the vast majority of the people who create waste. So it's not really helping at all in achieving that goal. And then we look at the cost benefit analysis of this thing, and it was found, this is an internal document, it is not public, but it's very clear that the document was telling us very clearly that the actual harms to the environment, to make the landfill levy strong and to put all those requirements to prevent the leakage, etc., they're very small compared to the amount that is being charged. So we're overcharging industry. So what is going on is industry is paying much more than they should for landfill. Industry is also paying much more than they should for electricity, for gas. Guess what is happening? All the industry is leaving Australia. Why? Because people who are in the environmental space, the greenies, you call them or whatever, they are cooking up these, charges on everybody, so-called to benefit us, but they're driving out industry from Australia. And this is one of the consequences of this cost-benefit analysis. You can easily see through this levy as a really bad idea. Yes, you can have a bit of a levy for industry, but no, it doesn't really work the way it is intended for the residential customer. We need to think of different ways to do it. Urban planning is another very good example of externalities. People say tall buildings, we don't want them, somebody wants them, somebody this and that, different views, okay? So there's a thing called planning scheme. Many of you are familiar with the planning scheme. It actually puts requirements and restrictions on what builders can do, etc. And these are exempt in Victoria from a cost-benefit analysis requirement. That's a really, really bad idea, but we won't go there right now. Nevertheless, due to efforts, and I will take credit for that personally because I was involved in getting this through, Due to efforts in the Treasury, where I was very actively involved, we got the cabinet to agree to conduct cost-benefit analysis for two of the major planning proposals in the last few years. One is the height limits in Melbourne CBD. Earlier, the minister could decide and they could have a 100-story building. Now they really put strong limitations through a floor area ratio, which is a really bad idea. But leaving that aside, they also said, okay, if you provide some extra benefit to the community, we'll give you extra stories for the building. That's called value uplift requirements, public benefits, and so on and so forth. I won't go into details, but that particular thing was basically a disaster. As far as I could see, and economists in the Treasury could see, it was going to cut down the growth of the CBD. It's going to make apartments very expensive, and really wasn't serving any benefit to anybody at all. Cooked up from thin air. The other was building better apartments, and it's quite okay to say a building should be safe. We don't want buildings that are built that fall down or whatever. But then we say we want to make them more durable. Now, that's not really something for the government to talk about. It's not the business of government to make a building durable. That's the business of the buyer and seller. Somebody might want a building only for 10 years, and somebody might want it for 100 years. Why should the government get involved in that? But the great planners of Victoria, they thought it's a good idea to impose more and more restrictions to make them more and more durable. And guess what? In the process, they make them expensive like hell. And so apartments in Victoria get more and more expensive because of these kind of regulations. And these two cost-benefit analysis clearly identified the significant spin-off effect or the effects on housing affordability. And so we were able to get them to cut down the restrictions to some extent. Unfortunately, not very successful, but that's the way CBA is. We never get a good final perfect outcome, but we do get an improvement through a CBA. One of the funny things that happened, I should mention here, since it's an untimed talk, is one of the CBAs actually has, and this is all public document, you can see it. There's a thing called intimidation effect. That means that if you're walking below a tall building, apparently you feel intimidated. Guess what? Did you know that you feel intimidated when you walk below a tall building? I wasn't aware of that. I used to really enjoy walking below tall buildings. It feels good, oh, look at the tall building on top of me. And here we are talking of consultants who say, no, it actually is a very big, problem, and so we need to reduce the heights. Well, if it's a 100-story building like Empire State Building, I've been on that. People go all the way. I've been to Chicago, the tower, the Sears Towers, and so on, and you actually go there to see them. You really enjoy the tall buildings. But what they're saying is, no, tall buildings are bad. They cost us $1 billion every year in terms of the damage done to our mental health. I've never seen more nonsense in my life. But hey, guys, at least it's transparent. You can then see how stupid this whole thing is. So half the stuff that the planning department does is complete nonsense and is very harmful to Victoria's growth and prosperity, is driving away business from Victoria, is driving away business from Australia. So these departments, environmental health and public health, etc., environment planning and public health, etc., are extraordinarily harmful, and energy now with the climate change, extraordinarily harmful, and they refuse to do proper CBAs. And this is where I think we need to impose the CBA requirement on everybody. The COVID lockdowns is, of course, the biggest disaster of all time. Nothing bigger than this has happened. No worse policy ever. And what happened here was that everybody, in the governments except Sweden, they said, okay, we'll eliminate we'll eliminate COVID with zero COVID policy. And that's what they said we'll do it through lockdowns. And it is never done before. And so they did it. And there were a lot of economists like Gigi Foster, Paul Fritchers, and others, and myself, of course, I was writing in terms of India, a cost-benefit analysis. Within the Treasury, there was a large number of economists demanding a cost-benefit analysis of these things in my department. But no government ever did a lockdown. Until today, no one has ever done none of the governments have done a CBA of the lockdowns. And so what has happened is a lot of academic economists have conducted CBAs, including, Martin Lally for New Zealand, for Australia. There are others across the world who've done it for Canada, for USA and other countries. And the recent one, of course, that I helped Gigi Foster do for Australia is very comprehensive. So what we've done, and the academic economists have concluded, is that the CBA, the lockdowns are far more harmful than any benefits they provide. we believe, and I believe, that even if the governments had done a simple 4-hour multi-criteria analysis, in 4 hours, they would have concluded that a lockdown policy is going to be extremely harmful, and so would not have done it. But they did not. They went into panic mode. And as I mentioned, Cass Sunstein himself went into panic mode. The great guru of cost-benefit analysis went ballistic and went crazy, hysterical. Is the funniest thing that's happened. Well, the funny thing is it's very harmful to the poor. So, people like you and I listening to this on YouTube, we got access to internet, etc., are probably okay. We survived. What about the poor? The poor in India, the poor in Africa, the children, 500,000 children at least have died from lockdowns that they estimate. And so we're looking at a total massacre due to lockdowns of the poor. Well, if that was the objective, then of course they're very effective. And so the other thing is cost-benefit analysis is not necessarily very cheap. Sometimes it's very cheap. You can do a quick one, but sometimes a proper one can take you 6 months of work and they can cost up to $500,000. A big one can actually be very expensive. Like for a full-fledged lockdown cost-benefit analysis for lockdowns would easily cost $500,000. But we're talking about $400 billion being spent to sort of deal with the effects of lockdowns. So the $500,000 is well spent. In all cases, it has been found that it is worthwhile to do a CBA. In fact, an analysis of the cost effectiveness of CBAs was conducted in Victoria. 10 years ago, they said, okay, let's look at all the CBAs and see, did the policy get improved during this process so that we could achieve an outcome that was better than if we had not done the CBA. And they found that the CBA had saved the community nearly $1 billion in unnecessary burdens. So the government was able to achieve the same goals at a much lower cost to society. Ultimately, the cost is passed on to business. The cost of doing business comes through these policies. And lockdowns is one example. So what happens with all these stupid ideas that are floating all over the place, particularly in the environment sector, the public health sector, the energy sector, infrastructure sector as well. These ideas are driving out businesses from Australia into other countries which have a lower cost of production. And then people say, oh my God, why are we not producing enough in Australia? Well, you're driving them away, guys. So if you don't do a CBA and if you don't do a proper CBA, you're going to drive out more and more businesses. So, of course, it's not enough to do just an ex-ante cost-benefit analysis. Like I mentioned, these are all ex-ante. You do before the policy. You can also do after the policy is implemented. You can do an evaluation. You can review regulation at any point in time. And, of course, there's a requirement for regulations to sunset. And so for them, a cost-benefit analysis is conducted every 10 years, which takes into account the changes in the environment and technology and so on. Now, I know that, as I mentioned right through this, despite the proven benefits of CBA, politicians are always trying to avoid them. And the reason is that the CBA imposes a discipline on the politicians. Politicians don't like, something that questions their belief. So they believe that they're right, they're perfect, and so we can't even ask them questions about why they say that a particular thing. So what these guys have done, the politicians in Australia, and if I were to get elected, I would change that. They have excluded very important areas from CBA requirement. They said if it's an urgent public health issue or urgent public safety issue, or if it's urban planning issue, etc., they are not required to do a CBA. No. They should do a CBA. They should do a CBA, but they can do a quicker, shorter CBA. You must not exempt anybody from a CBA requirement. And the politicians must be, forced to cough up the CBA so that we can see what exactly are they doing to justify a policy. The second thing these guys have found it very convenient, and Cass Sunstein, by the way, uses this in his article, precautionary principle. Precautionary principle is absolutely disastrous. I won't go into details in this short talk. You can read my articles on the topic. And also I've written about it in my book, The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. But the precautionary principle says, no, you don't need to wait for the evidence. You can just decide and proceed without any analysis. And it circumvents the requirement for CBA. Effectively, you can say, hey, precautionary principle, let's not do a CBA. That's a really bad idea. I need to remove, this is my recommendation, we need to remove the precautionary principle from all Australian regulation. It is the most dangerous piece of work. This particular thing, precautionary principle, is simply unacceptable. A short CBA can be done, a small short CBA can be done in 4 hours time. We do not need the precautionary principle to stop us from doing analysis, which is rational analysis. So what they're saying is we will not do rational analysis because we feel it's very urgent. No, that's not the way to do it. You have to do it. And so the other one that they have is the LIA. I mentioned the legislative impact statement for cabinet consideration. In most cases, this is not published. This is really a bad thing because the quality of the CBA in the LIA is very poor. We must always publish the LIA as part of the legislative statements. So this is, some of the things we need to fix, in going ahead. Overall, as you are aware, I've been talking about this for quite some time in my articles, books, etc. I've got 22 years of experience with CBAs, including a recent one, as you know, that I wrote along in which I assisted Professor Gigi Foster. So my suggestions are the following. All countries, all international organizations like the WHO must embed a CBA requirement for public policy. If we want to avoid the big policy mistakes, we must have them embedded in our laws. We've also seen that for routine policy matters, doing a CBA is always going to improve the public policy, always. There's never been a case that I've come across where a CBA did not improve the policy during the process of making it. So yes, it's a wonderful thing to have. For politically charged matters, we will never get a perfect CBA because what we'll have is the advisors and consultants and secretaries to the government, and everybody will say, okay, the minister wants it, let's just do it. It's too hard to fight every single battle. So they say, okay, let them do it. But the thing is that the next minister who comes, the next government who comes, so the plastic bags ban, I would remove the plastic bags ban. Okay, I would just get rid of it because it's so obviously stupid. And so the benefit of a CBA, public CBA, is that we can say that this is a bad CBA. And then the opposition party can say, no, that was not a good CBA, and they can actually go and change the policy. So we need a policy, even in matters which are politically charged or, where politicians are too much involved. Even those cases, a bad CBA is better than no CBA. And so that is the answer, the end conclusion. Even a bad CBA is better than no CBA. So let's do the CBA, guys. And in closing, there's a vast amount of literature on this topic. I'm just putting a couple of references here. I won't read them. You can just check them from the slides that I presented. And that is my overall summary of this concept. I hope you found it useful. I hope that you sort of become more interested in looking at CBAs that have been published. You also become more interested in demanding that all parties commit to a CBA for every single policy and that all CBAs should be published. They need not be perfect. They need not be very long. They need not be, full complex CBA. Even the short CBA should be published. And for example, in a lockdown case, you can publish a CBA practically every week because you can see the data has now improved. Now we got a new CBA. You can make a short CBA every week. It's not a big deal. And that would have saved us from all this chaos. All right. And that's the end of my little talk. Thank you.